And we're live.
Hi, Tim. Hi, Mahmood. I'm so excited to chat with you.
Absolutely. Hi, Christelle. Hi, Tim. Thanks for inviting me along to your wonderful show.
Welcome.
And we might as well start with Christelle asked me, like, how do you know this guy? And then he turned up on the pre-chat, and it's like, well, Mahmood is another regular conference attendee, but he is interesting as in he is a numbers person. He doesn't like the term the A word, so he won't say the A word too much about it. He is a business numbers person, or I think there was something else on your LinkedIn tag. How would you describe yourself, and how are you different from the other people who use the A word?
Okay, great question. Now, it's weird actually, Tim. In terms of, it's like if you want to clear a room at a party, you just say, I'm an accountant, and suddenly you'll turn around and the room will be empty. I have to say, even myself, when I've been at events where lots of accountants hang out, it's a great profession. I love it, but I personally speaking don't like to be introduced to too many, because it can, washing paint dry might be slightly more exciting. So I used to avoid the tagline accountant, but what I found is sometimes in social media or any sort of marketing, it's that Ronseal approach, isn't it? Yeah. Tell people what you actually do, and then you can have the conversation about how you might be different. So accountants is what I describe myself. Effectively for me though, why I'm different is because for lots of good reasons and bad reasons, lots of people dissociate themselves from the numbers in their business. Lots of businesses, social enterprises, private businesses, big entrepreneurs ignore the numbers, and they end up chasing their tail. They end up having I would call a dysfunctional life. They end up having a hobby more than a business. And for me, that money idea of making money, having time, doing the best you can for your clients gets dissociated and gets cut off because people just ignore what's under the bonnet. People don't understand why their numbers are so important. Well, people have got a stronger literacy for numbers than they give themselves credit for. So for me, my role is to try demystify it, break it down, and make business owners actually just connect more with what's going on and actually make some more money. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
No, not at all.
Mm-hmm. What is a problem that you particularly see out there with businesses, and how do you solve it in particular?
Okay, great question. So if I've understood you correctly, Christelle, so it's about major problem in terms of the space that I occupy is what tends to happen. I think it's very similar with CPAs in the US and accountants all over the world. Most people think about accountants, they think it's that once a year exercise. Yeah. I've got to make sure I keep the IRS, the HMRC authorities in the UK happy. So I've got to get my accounts, my books together. I give them over to somebody, or I'll do it myself. It's done. My tax return is filed. I'm not going to get any knocks on the door at 3 o'clock in the morning, and that's done. And that's great. And that compliance exercise we've all got to do. But it's the bit in the middle that the vast majority of people just ignore. So if I say to somebody, how much are you spending? How much profit are you making on this particular customer? Are you making as much there? What's going on? They'll look at me with a blank expression and go, I've got no idea. I don't actually know. For me, it's a bit like driving your car, not knowing if there's any petrol left in the tank or how far you've got to go before you get to your end destination. It just seems lunacy. But I can understand why, because I think it's that dissociation they have from what they've got to do in terms of keeping on the right side of the law, and actually what they should be doing to run a bona fide business.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a terrible offender at this in my business, especially as I used to work on an invoicing system when I was in corporate, and we used to do all sorts of like position and all sorts of like management information stuff. So, well, let's one of the big things I've heard, and I know, well, I think at least in this area I'm not too bad, is talk to us about the perils of cash flow versus profit for business, because I know that's one of the areas where they say that an awful lot of companies that fail are making a profit, but they fail because of cash flow reasons. So,
are you okay if I use my hands to gesticulate by those? I'm going to be off-putting for your audience. So
no, you can. I mean, you can jump up and down. You can do handstands if you want to do anything that it requires to make the point.
Okay, my mind might be agile, my body might not keep up with it. So here's what tends to happen. So if you run what I call like a cash business, so basically you do work for a client, the client gives you the money before you even get out of bed. Fantastic. If all your bills come in for your utilities and everything's cash, then you know pretty much what's going on there. Okay, and Second thing, there's a truism. There is a one true statement that I would say that's true for any business, whatever size. Once the money runs out of your bank account, once you cannot actually find those funds to pay your bills, pay yourself, pay everybody else, your business will not thrive. It will just go under. It won't survive. So cash, money in your bank account is the one thing that guarantees to keep all businesses going. Now, if I square the circle, if I go from big corporates like Ford Motor Company in the US, GM, for about 15, 20 years, it hadn't made a single profit. A cent of profit, but it didn't matter because you had General Motors behind it saying, here's some cash, carry on, we can sustain ourselves. Now, in terms of this idea of profit, accountants and finance people have got this idea about how do we measure this idea of profit, and money that we spend doesn't always get taken into account for when you calculate this profit figure. So profit, believe it or not, is something that most businesses will probably do, and they'll make it. But while they're waiting for their bills to get paid, while they're waiting for their customers to part with their cash there as well, they've still got strain going on and they've got to pay those outgoings. So most bankruptcies, if I was to generalize, most bankruptcies happen because profit is fine. And the perverse thing is you have got about 8 different ways to calculate the same number from different ways. So there's no standardized way of calculating profit. And number 2, though, is when that actually does happen, when you can make a profit, but behind the scenes, you've got money that you owe for debt, you've got money that you owe to all your suppliers, your customers haven't paid their bills, so you've got a strain on your own personal funding. And when that happens, that's when the two collide, and literally you will find that effectively that's when the business will fail. So cash is critical for keeping you going, cash is critical for growing, and cash is critical for sustainability. Profitability is not actually the main thing you need to focus on in the early stages of your business life.
If you don't have a follow-up, you know where I'm going with this, Tim.
No, and when I'm quiet, it's that I mean, it's your turn to ask the question.
This leads me into nonprofit and charity.
Okay.
I've worked in this sector. I know at least a couple social enterprises in the UK and also several in the US. What is the benefit to creating a social enterprise rather than a strict charity and nonprofit? And what is actually a social enterprise? Great
questions. If I work backwards on this, Christelle, I will forewarn Bev. When I used to be a teacher in a former life. And I remember at teacher training college, believe it or not, somebody likened my conversation like being spoken to by machine gun fire. So if it gets a bit too on the rapid intense, I haven't got that sensitive because I've worked in industry as well. I've worked in lots of sectors, so I've got to hide like a rhino. So if I'm going too quickly or too on me. So a social enterprise basically is a brilliant hybrid for somebody who's got an entrepreneurial flair, who likes the world of business, liking finding new opportunities. But a social enterprise is something that says, look, there's nothing wrong. You can make a surplus, you can make a profit. But it's what you do with that money that really just differentiates you from a normal private business. So if let's say Tim ran a private business, he goes out there, makes lots of money, sells lots of books, sells lots of courses, sells lots of consulting work, comes in, he's got a nice healthy bank balance, and he decides to use that to buy a plane, buy a yacht or whatever. That's perfectly fine. That's what a private business will do. He might occasionally give some money to charity, but that's not a social enterprise. If you, Christelle, did the same thing, but you said, you know what, with the profits that I make, I'm going to use the majority of those profits to plow back into my enterprise, to do good, to have some positive social impact, that's more of a social enterprise. Now, a charity, on the other hand, by the way, typically, even though they're developing in the UK and overseas to having a more of an entrepreneurial outlook, most of their money comes from donations, from trusts and foundations. It might come from what they call service level agreements, where a local authority or a funder would say, we need you to carry out a particular piece of work here. Here's a piece of work, but you've got a defined client group there as well. And effectively, there's a much tighter regulation, and it's not really a social enterprise. Lots of people, I don't know what it's like in the US though, Christelle, lots of people call themselves social enterprise and they mislabel it because they say, I do good stuff. I occasionally give money to charity. I give money to a food bank. I help the homeless. But if that's not the primary purpose of your business, you're not a social enterprise.
Mm-hmm. What I found actually is that nonprofits and charities want to be creative in how they fund what they are doing and how they give it away.
Yeah.
So they decided, okay, how can we turn this into a social enterprise so that we're doing both? And it becomes tricky because on the one hand, we're probably doing half and half. We're still trying to fundraise because we're not quite making the money yet from the social enterprise. Can you solve this problem for us?
Yeah, I would probably divvy that into two things. So there is always going to be, do you mind, Crystal, what's the nature of your social enterprise? What's the work that you're doing? What's the impact you're trying to make?
Okay, so in the past, I worked for a nonprofit called Traveling Stories, and we set up story tents around San Diego, where I live, to teach children to fall in love with reading or help them fall in love with reading. Now, we were in the process of turning it into a social enterprise by selling that idea throughout the county. And that's where the problem was. How do we do this? How do we make this into a social enterprise and actually make money on this idea while still helping children fall in love with reading and allow more people to be part of it?
Okay, I would probably say my approach would be is, first of all, in the context of a social enterprise, forget the fact that it's a charity bracket social enterprise. So forget about the label, forget about the structure, and think, if I took myself out of that and I ran it as a private business, would my approach be any different? So would my messaging be different? Would my communication be different? Would I actually price it differently? Would I actually communicate it differently? And the answer is yes, I would completely. I'd take some of that flavor, I'd probably encapsulate that, put that into your whatever you're doing, and your approach would be the same as it would be as if it was a private business. The difference would be twofold. One, any funds and profits that you generate goes back into the kitty, goes back into the pot to actually further advance what you're doing. One other thing that you might want to consider is sometimes there are activities which are very difficult to persuade people to spend money on. So therefore, what I would do is probably, if you looked in terms of the work that you're doing, you might say, look, here's an area of work that we're doing. We're trying to engage with this group of individuals. That's a very difficult thing for people to give money to. So we will fundraise for that activity, but actually there might be some transferable things that we can do. So we might be able to take what we're doing. We could use that as workshops within businesses to actually some employee engagement. Perhaps we could do something that develops their own workforce. Perhaps we could do some form of partnering, mentoring scheme where we get the employees to come in and do some reading with the children or whatever. That's something that we can encourage them to contribute to and actually raise money for. And what you've got a whole blend of different activities going on. Does that make some degree of sense, by the way?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I think it gets trickier when you start the nonprofit and then want to turn it into a social enterprise.
Absolutely. It's the thing. Do you know what it is though, Christelle? And I've looked at the US model for not-for-profits and social enterprises and charities, and I've looked at the UK equivalent here, and I've got some contacts and friends that work in the sectors across the waters. The biggest change in anything is what goes on between the ears. It's the mindset. And a lot of people who may have historically worked in the charity field, they think charity. And when I first worked in the charity field about 40 years ago, and I don't look old enough, if you mentioned the word profit, somebody would probably throw something at you. They thought it was a dirty word, that it was a vulgar word, disgusting. And it's like, how can you even talk about profit? That attitude has changed slightly. And I think people misunderstand that idea about profit. Profit is saying, it's cost me this. I need to provide that to somebody, and I need to at least recoup that cost and a little bit on top of it that goes back into reserves or surpluses. That mindset change is the biggest thing. Sometimes also, there's this what I call virtual signaling, and I'm going to be a bit blunt here. There's sometimes a bit of virtual signaling, and that people say, I work in the not-for-profit charity, therefore by nature, that makes me a good, virtuous person. And therefore, by the very nature of it, I don't have to act entrepreneurial. I don't have to act business-like. And, you know, business-like disciplines is about saying, look, I want to serve a customer. I want to do well. This is the things that I've got. I'm now going to go out and make a relationship connect, and therefore somebody says you do a great thing, you're solving a problem, doing some transformation, I'm going to give you some money for that. And that's the thing that people are going to get comfortable with, of being comfortable about providing a service and charging somebody for it.
Absolutely. And regardless, you still have to pay your employees.
Absolutely. 100%.
So it's a great idea just in that capacity alone, to make sure you have the money to pay the employees who are doing the charity work or the nonprofit work. So thank you.
100%. I mean, what I would probably say, apologies for flogging this to death, is to say to the people, like, do you want to have be looked after well as an employee? Do you want this organisation to be sustainable? Would you like us to be here in 12 months' time to carry on the good work? Well, if the answers are yes, where do you think that funds are going to come from? Because also fundraising and donations and relying on trust is also high risk. Because if the weather changes and the funder says we've got to cut now, you're basically stuffed.
Yeah, that's a huge benefit right there. You just hit the nail on the head right there. Absolutely, you'll still have the funding. So before I take over the whole interview, Tim.
Well, we've got the elephant in the British room that is Brexit coming up soon. So we're probably going to take over the next quarter of an hour interview. But I know that you've been doing quite a few kind of webinars and videos about Brexit, and especially the old chestnut of EU place of supply VAT rules, which I remember when they came in 2015, and there was a massive campaign to give everybody an allowance. Now that allowance is disappearing at the end of the year. So maybe you could explain the issue in a more clear way than what I just said, because everybody else is kind of like, what? Also, Brexit in general, what is it going to, what impact is going to have on businesses?
Let me talk about Brexit first as a quick synopsis, and I'll talk to you about people who sell digital in the online world and digital products.
Yeah.
So first of all, the thing about Brexit is largely we actually know what's going on, believe it or not. And for whatever reason, there's been a lot of noise around the world, especially in Britain, about COVID and pandemics, and Brexit has been put on the back burner. So the only thing that Brexit is going to establish is what I call trade rules. So when we bring things into the country, how much duty, tariffs are we going to pay? When things leave the country, what's the other side going to do? Fundamentally, we've been married to 27 countries for the last 47 years, roughly. Once we leave, technically speaking, on 11 p.m. on 31st of December 2020, we will be known as what's called a third country. So England, Scotland and Wales will be a third country. Therefore, we will be behaving exactly in the same way as goes at the moment when we deal with countries outside the EU. Now, what this means in a nutshell, when goods come into the country for your business, there will be VAT charged at the point of entry. When goods leave the UK, going to anywhere outside of those three countries I've mentioned, they'll be known as exports. And what that fundamentally means is three things. Number one, there's going to be forms. So you've got customs controls, you've got order controls, and you've got money changing hands for duties and tariffs and all the rest of it. Now, I'm not going to take up the whole session about saying what you've got to do. If you're okay, I'll share some links to blogs, but basically it's customs controls, border controls, procedures, and that flows everything from goods as well as people coming in and out of the UK. The second thing that's going to happen, and this is now moving on to digital, this is something that actually 140 countries around the world, by the way, it might be 160, actually operate some form of what they call digital taxes.
Yeah.
So because we live in a digital economy and countries around the world are worried and scared about losing out on tax revenue for countries that have very low rates of tax, very low rates of duty. Even in the US, I believe they're introducing sales taxes in certain states, in certain parts of the US, Canada. So everybody's got some form of digital tax. Now, what this means is that if you sell a digital product, so you've got an ebook or not another live show, you sell it into the EU, somebody buys a single copy, then you have to pay VAT that's charged in that person's home country. And also you've got to pay it over to that tax authority. That applies to anybody selling in the UK to any country in the EU. It's also, I know we're talking about Brexit specifically, if you sell a digital product, it could be a download, an ebook, an online course, anything that doesn't have a human being involved in there, all the responsibility is shifted on saying it depends where your person is located. That determines how much tax you pay. So you've got to register. Even if you're not registered for VAT in the UK, it still applies to you.
Yeah.
Now, it works the other way around as well, by the way. If you sell into the US, depending on which state you sell into, you're going to have a digital tax, no doubt. That's going to be levied on the rate that's charged in the state in the US. That's going to collect, but that's been fundamentally the same. That hasn't changed. All that happens now is when it goes into the EU, historically, you can sell up to about just under £9,000 worth of goods and not have to worry about registering. From the 1st of January, you're going to have to worry.
Yeah. I mean, in the US, I think it's most of the states have like about $100,000. That's why most people don't notice, like the US state what taxes. But in the EU, it's to say, yeah, it took a lot of fighting to get that $9,000 or whatever, and now it's back to zero again.
It's back to zero, correct? Quite right. And if you don't do that, look, I'm going to be extremist here in the sense, what's likely to happen if you don't do that? You got a stronger likelihood of getting caught now, because even the bigger companies like Amazon, all the world, these platforms here are wanting what they call tax identifiers now to say, before we sell you anything, prove that you are what your status is. If you don't comply, there'll be fines, there'll be penalties. In a worst case scenario, the country reserves the right to stop you selling in their marketplace.
Yeah. I mean, it's like one of the ways that people got around this before, certainly authors did, which is actually was against EU law, was to basically geo-block EU markets from their sites. But you're right. I think it's also places like Norway, South Korea. There's all sorts of places around South Africa. They've all got VAT rates with similar. A lot of them with no limits. So I think you're right in pointing it out.
Albania, Hungary. I mean, Hungary's part of the EU anyway. But as I said, approximately, when I looked a couple of days ago, out of 195 countries in the world, there's about 160 that have got some form of digital tax being applied. I think in the US they call them sales taxes. If I'm right, Christelle, is that what they're called in the US? Mm-hmm. But yeah, if you're an author, if you sell a digital product, and two things here, I think there's a misnomer. Some people fixate about the tax. Okay, that's a part of life, unfortunately. Yeah. For me, it's like, do you want to expand your business? Do you want to sell digitally? Do you want to expand your business enterprise? If so, get your act together. Because the actual compliance aspects, when you get your head around it, there is technology solutions, there's IT solutions, there's human being solutions, and pay the tax and just sell more products.
Yeah, though, I mean, I have some experience in this because I looked into this a lot in 2015. Okay. One thing to point out for authors is if you use KDP or you sell via Amazon, then they take care of that, which is one advantage to using a platform like Amazon.
Sure.
So anybody who's watching this who sells through Amazon doesn't necessarily need to worry about this. But there's lots of people who sell training courses and stuff who just seem totally oblivious to this. And it's like, because I mean, I think they could just go. I mean, I've only years and years ago, I had a tax investigation because I put something wrong on my self-assessment form, and that wasn't. And I was totally innocent. I was just like, I think I put too much down. But you really don't want to piss off any tax authorities anywhere if you can avoid it, because it's basically like divorce partner on steroids attacking you with a hammer, kind of, to be any contact with tax authorities.
The IRS managed to get Capone, so if they can get Capone, what's a humble man in the street going to do?
Yeah.
Mahmood, tell us about your podcast.
Oh, the I Hate Numbers podcast. Due credit where it's due. The name, I can't take due credit for that. It actually came up at an event, a Janet Murray event I went into last year. People talk about podcasts and what to do that. I'm thinking, okay, it sounds like a good idea. And for me, because I've always fundamentally, because I come from an educational background, I love helping people. I like mentoring. I do like making money as well. By that, I should just emphasise that point as well. I thought, right, most people in my experience, when you mention numbers to them, their eyes will glaze over. They'll think, I've got something else to do. Where can I go? So I wanted a podcast that was accessible. I wanted a podcast that helped business owners. I wanted a podcast that actually was jargon free as much as possible. I'm not saying I'm a brilliant podcaster, by the way, because you find your voice naturally after a while.
Yeah.
So I thought I Hate Numbers is a great antidote, and it's a great way to actually says what it doesn't do on the tin. So there's a weekly podcast. I cover a variety of topics there. Some are useful, some are probably not so useful. But it's on what I call practical need to know stuff for your business. So I've covered topics from planning for your business, why you need to do that, keeping an eye on the money, how to get people to part with the money, the cash that they owe you for bills, things like record keeping, budgeting. Brexit has come in there a couple of times as well. And fingers crossed, I think I'm episode 43 or 44 coming up to now.
Oh, wow. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And I'm going to do a screen share.
Oh my gosh!
Because you do these amazing videos with your wife. I'm not going to put the sound on. Actually, yeah.
I think that was banned actually in Iran and Korea actually.
I tell them, yeah, because I know you sometimes use a little bit of copyrighted music occasionally. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's just amazing that you've been doing these videos for a long time on LinkedIn, haven't you? Is it just on LinkedIn or are you on YouTube?
No, it's on YouTube, LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. I know people say you should always only focus on one platform, but I just one.
Yeah. This show's on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. So I'll add in notes. I'm changed, as people might have noticed when I've just stopped the screen share now. But in my QR code, I've now changed it so that it goes to show notes, so I can actually. Because the trouble is, I was putting a link to people's websites, but then they mentioned something totally different in the show. So I'll do a link to my website and then put the links from there onto the show.
I'm very impressed. Really high tech that is, that QR code.
I love QR codes. I mean, it's now that they never took off because Apple didn't support them until very recently. So it was only people with Android phones who could scan them. But places like China, they use QR codes for payments for everything. And I can see it's only a matter of time before they start catching on in the West.
It's only a matter of time before we all speak Chinese anyhow.
Probably.
Mahmood, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Leave us with one word of wisdom for the holiday season.
One word of wisdom. Okay, that's put me on the spot.
Maybe two or three. Like
my 3 words. I'll try and make it is recharge, relax, and reinvigorate and get ready for next year.
Beautiful.
I was probably greedy on the words there, but you're probably a better wordsmith than I am.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for joining us. And where can we find you?
You can find me, I suppose, through that QR code, but that might be difficult to write down. So you can get me at www.proactiveresolutions.com. I should know my own handle, shouldn't I? I'm going to cheat here because I always forget them. So if you're an Instagram person, Mahmood's Numbers Rockstar is one of the options. If you type, which we've always done, I'm sure most of us have done it, type in Mahmood Reza, Leicester, and you'll find me pop up there. Right there. So Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I'm probably a bit of a media. I don't know if it's appropriate to say media whore, but probably I like somebody who likes to get out there.
Well, thanks so much for being on the show. And yeah, basically just Google what's down.
Yeah,
Google
that.
Yeah. So yes, thanks for being on the show. And I'm going to play the outro now, and hopefully.
Have a great Christmas, you two. Have a great Christmas.
See you guys.
Happy holidays, everyone.
Happy holidays, yeah.
This is terrifying for me.
I've made more money in the last 3 years than I did in the previous 7.
Cliche shit, you know.